All right, well, it is right at the top of the hour, 11 a.m. in and around Washington, D.C. Welcome all. We are delighted to have you join us live, or maybe you're now looking at this recording of the session. We are here today as a first step in developing landmark legislation for encouraging the development of drugs and other regulated products that can slow the aging process and prevent chronic diseases, instead of simply just treating these diseases after they appear. Now, the Thrive Act is unprecedented in its scope and provisions for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and for other regulatory authorities around the world. We do hope that similar laws will be enacted in other countries. The Thrive Act responds to the immense opportunity provided by amazing science to substantially improve the public health. But today is but a first step. This bill is not ready for Congress. It needs to be worked through a cauldron of deep thinking and consensus building. Only then will it be ready for lawmakers. So let's now take this first step of the 1,000-mile journey. Over to you, Thomas Sir, Conexum CEO, who will moderate.
Thank you, Zan. This is a housekeeping reminder to enter any questions in the Zoom webinar Q&A function. A link to this recording will be circulated to all registrants and made publicly available within a day or two. The chat function has been enabled for audience interaction. So just for warm up, those of you who are willing, please say hi in the chat, your affiliation if desired, and from where you're logged in. I want to introduce the panelists. You know Zan, founder and executive chairman of Conexum, a regulatory, clinical, and product development strategic advisory firm, and president and founding board member of the not-for-profit Kitalys Institute, whose mission is to catalyze science in solutions for preventing chronic diseases and extending healthy longevity for all. David Fox is a global regulatory partner at Hogan Lovells, an international law firm with one of the largest food and drug law practices in the world. And he is a former associate chief counsel at the FDA and a founding Kitalys board member. He authored the first drafts of the Thrive Act and has acted as chief scribe over various collaborative revisions. Eve Harold is an award-winning science writer whose work has appeared in Time, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and other major publications. She is director of policy, research, and education for the Healthspan Action Coalition, a coalition of over 200 organizations dedicated to healthy longevity. Stephen Grossman, president of HPS Group, is a co-founder and a longtime past executive director of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA, and was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health at HHS and Council and Health Staff Director on the Senate Health Committee, where he was one of the chief Senate negotiators of the Orphan Drug Act and the Hatch-Waxman Act, and 2024 recipient of the Reagan-Udall Foundation FDA's Innovations in Regulatory Science Award. I'm Thomas Sir, CEO of Conexum and EVP and a founding board member of Kitalys. We will start with a fireside chat with Zan and David, then bring in Eve and Stephen, and then we'll work in audience Q&A. So please, again, put your questions in the question function. If you've not yet seen a draft of the Thrive Act, the text of the Act and a summary can be found at kitalys.org. So I want to begin with a question to David. Why do we need a Thrive Healthspan law?
Well, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Zan. I really am so appreciative that you brought me into this. And the short answer to that question is because Zan asked for one, and Zan deserves a Thrive Act. But more expansively, so I think we all would agree that the current regulatory framework and the current statute as it's been implemented over decades by FDA values intervention over or much more so than prevention. We have a wonderful system where if someone is able to show even a modest effect on a advanced form of cancer or life-threatening disease, that FDA has at its disposal numerous tools to help bring that product to market. And paired with that, there are well-known incentives for sponsors of innovative interventions if they're successful in bringing the product to market. On the other hand, if a product is designed to prevent that advanced cancer so that people never experience it in the first place, there is almost insurmountable regulatory hurdles to getting there. The risk-benefit proposition that FDA is accustomed to working with doesn't really fit well the type of evidence that would be generated for a Healthspan type product, an intervention in healthy adults that's designed to prevent age-related decline in disease. It's just not tuned to the needs of a Healthspan product or the practicalities of Healthspan product. I think in our sort of basic conception, a Healthspan product would be taken, again, by a healthy population, so it needs to be very safe. It would be taken over a long period of time. Given its safety profile, its effects may be modest and may not be apparent until we've had a long time to see its effects. And that means we would need large studies over long periods of time for ingredients and articles that likely have very little patent protection and are largely ubiquitous in either the prescription drug market or in other markets. And so it's really it's really just a sinkhole for innovation. It just all the arrows point against it. And so we've undertaken with the Thrive Act to address those issues and create an evidence-based system, progressive evidence-based system that has adequate incentives, so sponsors will invest in it, to bring Healthspan products to market, to allow for and give FDA permission to consider Healthspan type claims. And then second, to create the incentives that will develop a Healthspan ecosystem where there's a pairing on the part of the developers and the regulators, where they're with sufficient certainty as to endpoints, clarity as to endpoints, clarity as to the evidentiary standards, and incentives to protect the investment. So with that, we'll get into this in more detail, but we've created what we think is a milestone map for FDA in terms of evidence and a suite of calibrated, tailored incentives to bring Healthspan products to market.
Thank you, Dave. I see that people are entering questions already, so that's great. I think we will shortly be reviewing elements of the Act, and I think those questions are better dealt with that once we've shown you what is in the Act and what's not in the Act. So, Zan, what makes Healthspan products so different from other regulated products that they warrant new legislation?
Well, first of all, these products aren't different. They're actually the same products by and large that are already under development, already approved, or will at some point be approved. And they're not just drugs and biologics, but they can be even dietary supplements and medical devices. And we'll talk about how that would work in a moment. But the point is, it's not what products are involved here. It's really any solution that works, any regulated solution that works. And it's really instead about how do we get these products evaluated and approved and in the hands of people who would like to be able to prevent disease and not just treat them when they crop up.
What are the problems, David? What are the problems you're trying to solve with the Thrive Act?
Well, I think we've already touched on them. The main problem is while the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has always anticipated prevention as one of the functions of drugs and other regulated articles, the act and its implementation has just not been very good at recognizing prevention. And when it is looking at prevention, when the agency is evaluating prevention, it's usually single mode, single disease paradigm. So what we're trying to do is layer into the act across, as Zan noted, all product classes, foods, dietary supplements, drugs, biologics, devices, to layer into the existing act a concept of a Healthspan claim and a Healthspan outcome. And then most important to us is to do that in an evidence-based way, to create tiers of evidence to support conclusions, scientific conclusions as to Healthspan claims. And then to recognize that incentives are needed to encourage the industry to get behind these types of products and invest in the studies. So it's evidence-based in an area in which, without an evidence-based program and incentive, what we will end up with, and we've seen this already in the past, is a lot of unregulated, blurry, unsupported products. We don't want that. So what we're trying to solve for here is how do we drive towards a system that rewards doing the hard science, so that we actually will know one way or the other whether these products serve a beneficial function. So we're trying to solve for the evidence problem, and we've talked about how difficult it is to develop evidence for these types of claims. So we solve for the evidence problem, and we've solved for the incentive problem.
Thank you, David. Zan, in order to level set, not everyone has had a chance to see the draft. So what are some of the high level features?
Right, Thomas. Let's look at that. And I'm going to share my screen. I don't want to take more than a few minutes to do this slide sharing, but let's see if it's coming. Oops, I see. Here we go. And by the way, even if you read the Thrive Act draft, you probably were struck by the ponderousness of it. You may not have even been able to figure out exactly what the key points are. It was written purposely as a bill because that's where it's headed. It is in the convention of how Congress passes law. And so we put it in that form to make it more real. But in essence, let's talk about the Thrive Act and what, first of all, is the opportunity that inspires it. And that is that, and many of our listeners understand this and firmly believe that science is strongly suggesting that the aging process can be modified and the onset of age-related chronic diseases can be slowed. And the problem the Act is intended to solve, therefore, is that studies of healthy people, as opposed to diseased people, to prove that products work to slow age-related diseases could take billions and decades. And so the way the Act solves the problem, or at least attempts to approach the challenges here, is that it does break down the development of these products into more approachable steps, a progressive stepwise approach that David mentioned. And it adds incentives for developers. And this is needed as it was in the Orphan Drug Act. And that's one reason we brought Stephen Grossman on, a father of the Orphan Drug Act. We need incentives for developers to invest in the somewhat expensive studies or programs that will be required to have the evidence that is needed to support the effectiveness and safety of these products. And the main intent of the Thrive Act is to make these products available to people who want them sooner than later. That's really what Thrive is aimed at doing. So everybody is, I'm sure, wondering about levels of evidence. What the heck are you talking about? And to put it in practical, conceptual terms, stay with me a moment. First of all, under the current system, we have products being approved for all kinds of disease and disease prevention indications on the basis of what is called substantial evidence of effectiveness. And that gives a full approval, or what FDA calls a traditional approval. That's a pretty high bar for any product that is being approved. We also more recently have at FDA something called accelerated approval. It allows products to be given to patients who desperately need them on the basis of somewhat less comprehensive evidence. And so that is our system now. What we're proposing is regulatory pathways that start off with Tier 3 being very much similar to a full approval, and then somewhat comparable to an accelerated approval would be Tier 2 approvals. But the novel category is Tier 1. This is a first step where there is still substantial evidence required, but of a totality that is less than would be the case for, say, an accelerated approval. So just to talk about the kinds of levels of evidence and the incentives for each tier. Tier 1, we would say, requires robust scientific and early clinical evidence that the product is reasonably likely to increase Healthspan. And that gives an exclusivity that lasts for 7 years. Now, David can talk about what exclusivity is if that question needs to be addressed. But that is a way of incenting drug developers to get into the game. Tier 2 requires intermediate clinical evidence that demonstrates the product is likely to increase Healthspan. And that, again, provides exclusivity for an additional 7 years. And 7 years is arbitrary. We picked that, but it could be less or more. Then finally, Tier 3 is essentially the same standard of evidence that is generally required for any conventional approval at FDA. And that provides additional exclusivity. So you're saying, what kind of evidence could support an indication approval, a Tier 1 approval? And it would be, among other things, robust scientific evidence, a combination of in vitro animal model data, imaging, and human genomic studies, for example. It would also involve early clinical evidence, but long enough to be meaningful. It could involve epidemiologic studies and clinical trials of 10 weeks or a duration or longer. And this altogether would be sufficient to be persuasive to experts that the product is reasonably likely to increase health span. So that's the Thrive Act, the rationale and the elements of the Thrive Act in essence. And we'll come back to more detailed questions as we go on.
Thank you, Zan. Let's just, I guess, deal with sort of an elephant in the room. Some people have suggested that aging should just be legislated as a disease for which interventions should be assessed and approved by FDA. Why does Thrive not take that approach?
Well, the question is predicated on, for some people, believing that FDA doesn't have the authority to approve preventions for diseases. And of course, that's not the case. We have vaccines. We even have products like statins, which I approved when I was there back in the day, many years ago. So FDA, and David has mentioned this, has the authority to approve prevention products, and they've done so. We've actually got prevention approvals for GLP-1 one agonist in people who have obesity or diabetes. These products reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. So that is not a reason to make aging a disease. I think there is a rationale for making aging a disease for purposes of payment. The WHO has set up an elaborate system of codes for facilitating the support of clinical practice. But here's the point, that making aging a disease would not change one iota the clinical trial designs and the evidentiary standards to put aging as a disease indications on the market. It's the same kind of evidence that would be required. And so for purposes of regulatory approval, it's not going to help FDA to make aging a disease.
Thank you, Zand. But I see various questions on this topic, but why would pharma support a Thrive framework if they have gotten good at negotiating the current system? What are other stakeholders going to be thinking about a Thrive Act?
Yeah,
go ahead.
So, you know, first of all, it's evidence-based, and that's pharma's expertise. And second, it will significantly expand the range of targets and claims now available for developers. So it's a new frontier that plays to the strengths of pharma because it's evidence-based, and then there are some familiar incentives that go along with it. In addition, I'd say that, you know, if you look at the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act from the early 90s, you look at the expansion of and recognition of compounding under the statute, those types of light touch regulation have really been the bane of pharma. And so I think if we can design a system that directs us more towards the evidence-based system and less towards the gray market and unregulated system, I think that harnesses the true strength of pharma.
I might just add some concrete examples, because big pharma, or pharma in general, is already developing products that actually prevent chronic disease. We mentioned the GLP-1 agonist as a good example, but it's in people with obesity and or type 2 diabetes, not people who don't have diabetes and don't have obesity. That's the big difference. It's a much larger population that we're talking about. And so it's a additional opportunity for companies that already have disease indications to go after indications for actually making these products available to people who don't have the diseases yet. And that's I think, a very attractive proposition. The only problem is that the kind of studies that it will take to show that the product works are going to be longer and larger than typically would be the case for disease treatment indications.
And, I might just interject here also when thinking about the insurance industry and their position on all of this. The cheapest way to treat a disease is to prevent it from happening in the first place. And so what we're looking at is trying to reorient the healthcare system from a sick care model, which, treats diseases in pretty much advanced stages, given, what kind of imaging technology is used to assess the disease and the state and everything. It would be much more effective in the long run. Now, the question is, we need to try to get the business community to look at the long-term benefits of these types of treatments as opposed to just focusing on short-term turnarounds.
And Eve, that's well
Good.
said. I just wanted to mention that Jerry Kokla asked that a question that was related, and that is, how is this going to work in our current system of reimbursement? And the devil obviously will be in the details, but at least a pound of prevention is worth, or an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. No, it's the other way around. Anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. The point is, we will have to work that out, but it will, I think, be shown that prevention is actually economically favorable to payers and everybody else who's involved.
Let me throw in two other points. First, we have included, if we get into the minutia, some particular incentives for repurposing existing drugs. So the Thrive Act provides an opportunity to go back and restudy and redevelop already approved products, and then there are particular incentives and rewards for doing that. Second, on the coverage issue and the approval issue. So, not to belabor this, but even an accelerated approval is technically a full approval and should be reimbursed, although there are a lot of questions being raised about that by providers these days. But we've designed the system so that each tier of approval is a full approval. There are milestones that need to be met, but we would regard it as a full evidentiary showing for the particular claim that's being made. Now, I appreciate, and I'm not a coverage lawyer, that prevention so far, it is a very difficult term to accept under federal payment programs. So and this is maybe more Steve Grossman's area of expertise, but this is where the new administration may come in and may help in creating a better reimbursement ecosystem for prevention.
Yeah, let me step in and take a different slice of that, which is, I wrote a column yesterday for FDA Matters, and one aspect of it was you have to have a regulatory pathway to have inventors and investors. And you have to have inventors and investors and a product to challenge, to bring to the reimbursement system. And I think that if you start at the end, you just get caught up in your head. And this should not be key to what will insurers pay. It's what can we create that's of value that insurers wind up seeing they have to pay for. And I don't want to prejudge how good these are going to be. I think the opportunity for products, and I think there was a question I want to touch on, which is, yes, the FDA Act does include prevention, but as it is practiced by FDA and in FDA law, that is prevention of a disease. And what we're talking about here is a cluster. We're talking about the aging process itself. And that is a much different, it's the same word, prevention, but it's different. So I guess I would say, let's worry about getting a system in place that creates some regulatory certainty, brings the investors, brings the inventors, brings the companies, and these things aren't going to be ready until a point at which the reimbursement system probably will be quite a bit different because it will have been challenged already by how do you address large scale populations like Alzheimer's.
Well, great point, Steve. And just to add, it's going to take ways of incentivizing development of evidence seeking or development of products based on solid evidence that they do prevent multiple chronic diseases. And that's based on the supposition that there are shared root causes of the chronic diseases, and that by targeting these root causes, you're going to have effects on multiple diseases. Now, there's nothing that prevents a company from pursuing prevention of single preventative indications, for example, for cardiovascular disease. The only thing is you need to use people who don't have the disease. What we believe the science teaches us is that there is the opportunity to actually show that multiple diseases are slowed or prevented in their onset. And if they're not, at least we will have evidence, perhaps, that only one disease is affected by an intervention, but that in itself will have some value to the company that has done that kind of trial.
Maybe there's a lot of action going on in the chat and the Q&A, and we'll get to that very quickly, but just a couple of thoughts that are of interest to the geroscience community. How would biomarkers, biological clocks, intrinsic capacity, how would that be treated under Thrive? Digital intelligence, AI, machine learning, digital twin, things of that sort.
Well, all that stuff can be very helpful. The devil will be in the details as to what is necessary and sufficient in a particular case to support a particular agent to have a Healthspan claim. But I say yes, biomarker data can be very helpful, supportive. Now, by definition, a biomarker is not considered in itself a way to approve a drug until it is validated, until it reaches what we call surrogacy. That's based on studies that show that the biomarker reliably predicts benefit when there is a treatment effect on it. And so that's the distinction that needs to be understood, that biomarkers, until they become surrogates, will have a secondary supportive role. But it's all the things that you mentioned and more. And the technology is amazing. The computational technology and the technical advances that have made in all kinds of omic research, all this can be supportive evidence that would help to achieve a tier 1 approval.
I just want to say, though, and you're absolutely right, Zan, all of those things need to be included, and we need to be open to emerging technologies that are in development now because, we can only expect the technological, techniques to kind of, they're growing exponentially. So we need to be open to that. But I just want to say there is an impediment here, and that is that there really is no universally agreed upon biological clock. So we have people working on different kinds of biological clocks, and we're in the infancy of finding biological clocks. So, some scientists think it's epigenetics. Some people think it's DNA methylation. We don't really have an agreement, but I think as the science moves forward, we essentially will, develop some kind of consensus. The other impediment is that we don't have internationally, never mind nationally agreed upon metrics for measuring health span. So we can look at organs and disease states and things like that and kind of create a composite picture of a person's health span. But we need to incorporate accurate measures of biological age and all the rest of the technology being brought in to assess the totality of the organism, because aging is a global condition. It's not just, it affects, your heart or your liver. It affects everything. So I think the Thrive Act is a huge advantage to advancing this kind of research and creating this kind of consensus. If it's out there, eventually we'll get there. We need to take baby steps right now, but we are looking at a certain amount of uncertainty in terms of being able to precisely measure, age, biological age, disease states, life expectancy, and all the rest of it.
So
Well,
there
Eve,
are, go ahead,
I
Sam.
just wanted to tag on here because those are great points. And it also reminds me to stipulate that health span is a somewhat crude term. It's even controversial for some. It is palpable. If you can understand what it means to say it's the period of life that's free of chronic disease. But how do you actually determine that? There's nobody who's really completely healthy by the time they're 40 or 50, or at least there may be underlying disease that's not detectable. Health span is going to be hard to pin down. It's an important challenge to come up with how we would, in practice, define health span for clinical trial purposes and for clinical practice. That's where there's a lot of work to be done.
Totally agree.
What we confront, I think, fairly directly in Thrive is this issue of whether full clinical validation is needed of all the various models, Eve, that you're describing before we can move forward and rely on those. And if that's the position that we need for regulatory purposes, full clinical validation before we can move forward, we will never get there. And no one will, absent full government intervention, you wouldn't get private developers to invest in that kind of validation, at least to current FDA standards. And so there's a critical policy judgment that needs to be made, and you put your finger on it, Eve. It's uncertainty. How much uncertainty are we willing to accept in order to advance Healthspan products, now, rather than some mythical time point when we've clinically validated everything and we won't get it. So all of these different regulatory tracks and evidentiary channels all come down to an acceptance of a certain level of uncertainty. Regulatory science is not pure science. It's science bounded by rules of law and standards of evidence. And so we're trying to come up with a regulatory science approach for Healthspan products, trying to surface what is exactly is the level of uncertainty, what are the risks, and how can we calibrate the approval pathway so we can stage it in a way in which we're learning along the way. And I think Eve, as you and others have pointed out, the tools available to us are so much more sophisticated than the tools that we could even imagine when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was first conceived in, the 1900s. Then we had 1938, then 1962, then 1997, then 2012. I mean, we have to recognize every 20 to 25 years, the act, from an evidentiary perspective, goes through a significant change, and we're ripe for another one.
That's exactly right, David. And, some of the technologies that are coming down the pike, like digital twinning, have the ability to be much more precise. I mean, down to the molecular level than any other technique that we have in our, toolbox. So I agree that the act and the whole movement needs to continuously evaluate and incorporate these developing technologies, as well as, and I'm sure your listeners are thinking of AI assisted research in the lab, things like that. Those things are accelerating change, and this is going to continue to accelerate for the foreseeable future, and we need to prepare for that.
If I may, I'm itching to get into the Q&A and the chat subjects, but maybe one last question. David, you made a reference to building on regulatory science. The other side of it is kind of a move quickly and break things kind of approach. And Stephen, I wanted to ask you this because I know in a prior conversation a little while ago, you were kind of expressing the point of view, we kind of need to sweep stuff aside and start engineer something fresh. I don't know if you still think that, but maybe would you share with us your thoughts about the Thrive Act and its approach?
Well, I had a much longer answer that I'm not sure this is the right place for it, that starts with looking at the Orphan Drug Act and how that's evolved over time and trying to put that frame on both current events. So is this the moment to do that? I'll do it. Otherwise, let's wait till we're deeper into discussion.
Well, we're 45 minutes into a 90-minute session. I think we're in the guts of it.
Okay. All right. And by the way, to make David Fox's point clear, about how things evolve over years, for a lot of years, I was asked, well, why didn't Hatch-Waxman cover biologics? And I'm like, well, in 1984, there were a couple of products and a couple of companies, and nobody had any idea what we were doing. So of course it didn't include it. Now, obviously any question about drug policy has to at least say, and what do you do with biologics? So times change, frontiers change, and that'll actually play into my point about the Orphan Drug Act. There was always all those, let's say 20 plus years after the Orphan Drug Act was enacted, in which there was always this undertone, this sort of gossipy undertone, that people with rare diseases were getting a break on the regulatory process, that the standards had been lowered, and that somehow approvals of orphans was somehow less good, less final, less thorough, less helpful than approval of a drug for a larger product. One of the things that changed that dialogue, Frank Sosnowski did an analysis in 2010, which he repeated again in 2020, in which he showed that that standards had evolved in terms of interpretation, but that the standards by which orphan drugs were being judged were essentially the same and not different. And you still hear a little of that gossip, but not what it used to be, because we do understand that. Now, here's the thing. Now, Orphan drugs now, okay, we can accept that premise. They really haven't been given, they've been given some flexibility, but they really haven't lowered the standards for them. Well, right now, the orphan drug field is dealing with two challenges that may not fit the, oh, okay, we just evolve in our interpretation of the law. One of which is N equal ones trials. How do you figure out if an N equal one works? Okay, and that has to take you at some point out of any semblance of the two controlled studies or et cetera, et cetera. So that's a challenge that's still being looked at because you no longer say, well, it's an orphan drug and orphan drugs with some interpretation and a little help meet the full standards that the law requires. The other way in which the orphan drug field and the orphan drug standards are being challenged is progressive neurodegenerative diseases, which are heterogeneous and good, solid, well-conceived trials fail because the outcomes are so varied and what you have is so uncertain in a lot of ways. And that's a challenge that's also being taken on. Now, my point here is orphan drugs paradigm worked for a long time and it still mostly works, but we're looking at situations that we're finally at where some broader thinking, some greater compromise with the acceptable standard is going to be needed. And I look at Healthspan as the same situation, which is that we can do all the pushing and pulling and tugging. We can do our Frank Sosnowski studies, but in the end, these are in fact not, there are different of type of kind and not just degree. And that it makes sense to say, what is it that gives the American people sufficient safety and efficacy that might not be the same as how we apply to more traditional drugs. I make two further points on that. I see the neurodegenerative disease as maybe a lead blocker for this kind of, for Healthspan, because they're going to have to break the rules somewhere on that. And I think that provides an opportunity to challenge the system further and say, just as there's just no way to put heterogeneous, progressive neurodegenerative diseases into a box that looks like the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I think Healthspan raises the same challenge. It's going to come later than I think the neurodegenerative. So that is the lead blocker to me. Look where changes, where more ambitious, more controversial approaches are being looked at as to what constitutes sufficient efficacy and sufficient safety. So that's sort of my picture where we are and why maybe we aren't going to wind up or we're not going to get satisfactory answers without breaking the paradigm. I'd add as well, the times are favoring that approach because this is clearly an administration that has no compunction about breaking paradigms, about looking at things differently. And so I like Thrive, don't get me wrong, and I think the cause is a very good one. And I'm just raising the question as I have with Zan and the group before, which is you're going to be dealing primarily with people who have a very conservative approach, and you want to make it look as much like the current system as you can. But the reality is, like progressive neurodegenerative diseases, it may, when you get done, it may just not fit. And we don't want to say we can't do it because it doesn't fit. Enough said.
Stephen, if I can feed back to you what I'm hearing, you're saying that precision medicine and precision health are different animals than the way in which drugs are approved for the general population in the past. And my question is, maybe within the framework of a Thrive Act, those kinds of decisions can be made by guidances or discussion or cultural change or what have you. I don't know what you can legislate, from the standpoint of, specific solutions to the problem that you just posed. But could we, there are two topics that I see in the questions. One is, how practical is it? How passable is the Thrive Act? Who's for it? Who's against it, et cetera? And then does it actually solve the problem sufficiently? Will it incentivize? So can I throw that out to the panel, please?
Let me offer a very basic answer to that, and I think others can provide a more rarefied answer. So given my involvement with putting the initial draft together, with one or two very small exceptions, everything in the Thrive Act is drawn from existing regulatory systems. So the concepts are and the mechanics are all pulled from existing standards that are in use. So there's not a lot of things that are completely novel. It's just the way it puts them together. And it's crafting a channel based on existing standards of evidence. It just arranges them in a way that makes sense for Healthspan products. So in that respect, it's not as if somebody would open the Thrive Act and say this doesn't make any sense under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In fact, as Ann said, it builds off of the existing regulation of all the product categories. The only not really novel aspect of it that would take some explaining is that, given the nature of some of the Healthspan products that we envision and the fact that the products may already be available in other forms, it may be very difficult to protect one's exclusivity. And so we have included in the Thrive Act what we call a private right of action to enforce or bring in a Lanham Act type trade practice claim against somebody who's using your claims if you have exclusive rights to those claims. So you would not have to rely on going to FDA and begging FDA to bring an enforcement action. You'd be authorized to bring a very limited private right of action to enforce your exclusivity rights. And that would be new under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Other than that, everything is drawn from existing authority. But that's the basic. From what passable from a political sense, I'd have to look to
Well, I think
others.
that was a question, David, that people in chat were asking. So maybe Stephen first and anyone else. Are there congressional sponsors? What do we need to do? How practical is it? Who are the people who are going to oppose this?
Let me, take the first crack of that. Nothing like this just happens. It takes a bill.
Unknown caller.
Okay. Everything requires a build that, and so, the question is it possible? Isn't the answer you got to start. You got to get the reaction. You got to get the feedback loops. You got to consider the possibility that while that the Thrive Act as conceived works in a completely evolutionary way, and we might find ourselves that what sells right now is revolutionary. You want to change it? You don't want to change it? I don't know. And I don't think we'll know until we have first what we have now, a comprehensive proposal, materials to support it. It then needs to be offered up for consideration by elected officials who have expressed interest in it. And we are definitely in an era in which chronic diseases as a topic is on an upswing. And so is it politically feasible? Well, I mean, I would have told you a lot of things I've actually personally been involved in weren't possible. And even when we did them, the Orphan Drug Act, I think we all thought we'd done a good turn, but we didn't think we'd transformed the world. And I think we all would have been shocked to learn that it would still matter 40 years later because nobody thought that way. Well, I think we are starting to look longer, and this requires people to look longer. And that's also harder because people don't say, well, what's it going to be next year? I mean, one of the things that made Orphan Drug Act work was that it worked in a 3 to 5 year context. Here's what's going to happen, what people are going to do. I think that how you sell this really depends on the times. But the political process basically doesn't change. You got to work the system, you got to convince people, you got to build coalitions.
But to be clear, we are the first to stipulate that this is not ready for Congress. We need to do just what Stephen is suggesting. We've got to workshop this and get widespread input and ultimately support. We've got to compromise probably in some ways. And so it's going to take a process to make this ready for Congress people to consider. That will be a process. And by the way, what this bill does, it just provides a framework. It doesn't get down into so many important details. It just can't. The Orphan Drug Act doesn't do that. No law that is passed by Congress gets into the kind of detail that will be required. And so, just as an example, for every iteration of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there are probably tens of thousands of papers of guidances that FDA writes to show how they interpret the law and how it will be implemented. And so it's going to take FDA writing guidances that will help sponsors to understand what the expectations are. And that too is a process. It's not going to happen overnight.
And I would just add, this is the first step in a long journey. And part of that, what we need to do is to educate Congress. Because, these are new concepts. These are they're all familiar to us. So we kind of assume that people know what we're talking about when we say health span. And that's really not the case. And, and again, I want to say David is absolutely right in the sense that, because there isn't a very detailed, precise definition with metrics and all that to define health span, we have to have a working understanding of what we're doing to move forward. And then we just take it one step at a time.
Is there any room in this, and I haven't thought about this, for some model demonstrations where Congress might authorize 5 X's? I don't know what the X would be. And FDA then, in conjunction with industry, I think, then sort of works it out a little bit as to what it would look like and whether it can produce a viable product at the end. That's a little dramatic,
I
but
think
also think about
it's
biosimilar.
a great thought. It's really a great thought, Stephen. And we're seeing, in a way, some models for that. For example, ARPA-H has a program that is aiming to move the needle in this field. And so they are attempting to catalyze development of endpoints that would facilitate the development, including aging clock markers, which could be ultimately surrogates. And the X Prize has been set up to incentivize development among entrepreneurs who are wanting to get into the game or willing to do so. And so the point is, we could really benefit from some of these early initiatives that allow us to get our feet wet and not have to jump in whole hog.
Yeah, I think there's room for that. And the other model I was thinking about was biosimilars, where FDA more or less steadfastly refused to provide general guidance for about 5 years. And their posture was, we're not entirely sure what the rules should be. So we're going to deal with the first, I don't think they put a number in it, but it turned out to be the first 50 or so sponsors got personal service, if you will, until FDA felt it understood enough to do general rules. And that's a variation of the demos and the models, which is that one barrier to this is nobody's done anything quite like it before. And so maybe one way to slice it is, can we create some pieces in the front to give people confidence that phase 2 and phase 3 are going to work?
I want to repeat the second question and then just make an observation. But the question is, does the Thrive Act solve the problems it's identified? Does it go far enough? Will it incentivize people? I mean, why would someone with the Thrive Act develop a rapamycin, for example, for a tame trial-like indication? Why would a supplement company trouble to invest in a large clinical trial that gets them marketing exclusivity, but not sort of IP level exclusivity? But if you could think about that for a moment, I just want for the audience to comment on, elaborate on Zan's point. This is a framework. And if others want to propose a framework, that's fine. We're happy to look at it and we'll choose the better one. But this is identifying issues. And if people have specific, there are proposals like, let's have an expedited process like breakthrough or RMAT for Healthspan drugs. Wonderful. That fits in a certain part of incentives. We have incentives about vouchers, pediatric voucher-like vouchers, or prizes. Those are hinted at, they're listed in the Act, and we'd invite people to look at the structure of the Act and use them as prompts. And if they have a better suggestion, let's all throw it into the pot. But let me come back to the question I'm posing to the panel, which is, does the Act actually solve the problem? Does it go far enough? Does it? What's the impact? Is it a ho-hum, or is it actually going to make a difference?
I don't think we can answer that question today. You need to ask the people who matter. That would be the developers. And that would also include investors and entrepreneurs, big pharma, smaller pharma, biotech, medtech. We can speculate on what would float their boat, but we can't tell you reliably. We have put out some feelers. We've asked for feedback from various quarters. And now we've opened up the floor for as much feedback as we can get from those who are directly affected or would benefit, as well as public-minded people who would have concerns about what would be provided here in the Act.
Yeah, I can add to that. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Steve.
David, no, go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, Zan's completely right. It's hard to know how people will react to the incentives and putting real money behind them. But we do have a lot of experience, and we've tried to bring that experience to bear in the design of the Thrive Act. So Steve started with the Orphan Drug Act. One could say today the Orphan Drug Act is more about the incentives than anything else. That's the way it evolved, the 7 years. When I was at the agency, we tried mightily to come up with ways to incentivize the industry to do pediatric studies. But it was the BPCA, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, that added just 6 months of exclusivity. And then suddenly the pharma industry couldn't do pediatric studies fast enough. Everybody came.
Mhm.
We know, on the other hand, for example, the GAIN Act for generating new antibiotics has been largely a failure on the incentive side. It adds 5 more years to your existing exclusivities, but 5 years to a drug that nobody wants to be used, that we want to lock in a closet and give very little limited claims to, doesn't incentivize anybody. We know that rare pediatric disease voucher, and also for tropical disease, has been very successful because of its transferability. And so we have built into the Thrive Act a variety of incentives, including something along the lines of a trade. We have the transferable voucher, but also the opportunity for transferable exclusivity. So to use a successful existing product for a rare disease or a disease population to subsidize, in a way, the development of a Healthspan product. So if the commercial viability of a Healthspan product is relatively low because of the nature of the product and the protectability of it, you'd be able to transfer your exclusivity to somebody who has much better capability, because the barriers to entry are higher, of protecting that product. So yes, it's speculative, but I think we're very cognizant, and I've been at this for more than 30 years, of what is an incentive for the industry and what is not. And this is going to require a substantial incentive. And that's what's built in. We also include, along the lines of what Steve was mentioning, we do have prize, the idea of an allocation of prizes for development in certain areas. So that's a little bit along the lines of a pilot, but people who go the extra mile and solve certain problems in the Healthspan area would be eligible for prizes. So we build that in as well.
And I'm going to not only endorse the idea of we don't know which incentive will work, but it is something you can focus group, you can meet with people. I want to put in a word for the good old market exclusivity, which seems to be diminished in a lot of people's mind because they see ways around it. And I do remember, I think this was GAO, but I could be wrong. I was surveyed on the question of, at the time of approval, most orphan drugs have more than 7 years of IP. Why is market exclusivity of value? And the answers are twofold. One, market exclusivity is more certain than IP. And the other is market exclusivity can't be challenged in court the way IP can. So that notwithstanding the fact that there are incentives that are longer and would appear to be better, the reality is, because of the element of certainty in the case of marketing exclusivity, it's valued. And I think in this case, and GAIN is a good example, we have to figure out what is the right incentive that will move investors, will move inventors to put the time and energy into this. But I think the case that incentives work in general is more than proven. And I would say that there's probably a reason to go back and look at GAIN and see how it should have been configured in light of the fact that it didn't work.
Yeah, quite familiar with that. Yeah, so those surveys often net out, and this is an overall average, that a new drug gets 13 to 14 years of exclusive marketing, including IP and regulatory exclusivity. There are obviously ones that go much longer, and there are ones that are shorter, but it's about 13 to 14 years, which is also the maximum amount of patent term that somebody can get with a patent term extension under Hatch-Waxman. So the 14 years is something of a magic number. 12, it's 12 years for biologics, but that 13 to 14 year zone, and that's exactly where we net out in our progressive system. It's a 14. So you would emulate, if you imagine a repurposed drug being developed progressively for Healthspan with no composition of matter IP, and probably very tough to get enforceable method of use IP. We would compensate for that by and emulate the IP that they would have gotten by giving them 14 years of exclusivity if they hang in there and go through the progressive system.
And by the way, we even toyed with the idea of talking about IP in the act, but that's the bridge too far.
You're right. We kept that out. Yes.
It's obviously not the domain of FDA.
Yes.
And it's not to say that there shouldn't be a new look at by the Congress and the authority of the U.S. Patent and Trade Office, or USPTO, but that's another domain.
Well, I have a question for David and anybody really on the panel, is that how does the exclusivity concept work with repurposing existing drugs?
How do the 3 tiers work for example, for metformin or rapamycin, or generic semaglutide, or for that matter, tirzepatide, which is currently patent protected?
So essentially, for a repurposed drug, so we're assuming something older, there may already be generics available. There's no real IP estate. With each progression from tier 1 to tier 2 and tier 2 to tier 3, they would get 7 years of exclusivity. If it were a drug, it would be a 7-year bar and FDA approving the same drug for the same indication. But we recognize that there will be a significant amount of off-label use of that drug if it's already available widely in generic form. And so we include the private right of action if anybody who makes that drug in any way expresses or implies the Healthspan claim, you could go directly to court. You could initiate that action yourself as a private right of action rather than have to go to the agency and complain about it and fall into a kind of a black hole of, little to no hope of getting the agency to act. So that it's not perfect. When you talk about repurposed products that are widely available, we can't go and pull all those products off the market. So you're playing into a space that may already be occupied, but you are given, you at least have the knowledge that FDA could not on label approve anybody else during that 7-year period for the Healthspan claim that you proved up, and that you'd have this private remedy where you see, and the remedy is substantial. It's damages, monetary damages, not just injunction. And there is the opportunity we include for somebody who willfully tramples on your exclusivity to pay triple damages, so which is common in antitrust law. So that's also not new. But we try to create a powerful disincentive for people to try to trample on your exclusivity.
But we recognize that free riders, if patients are buying generics not under that label for that purpose, that's an area that we cannot address for generics. What about other modalities? I mean, a while ago, I think it was last year, we had a targeting healthy longevity session from Mars for a Cosmos trial relating to a flavanol supplement. How would a supplement be run under the tiers 1, 2, 3? And are these the same standards that are applicable across the modalities for devices?
Yeah, let me take that, because this is a good example of a kind of product that could get a tier 1 approval. And it's not a drug, although it could be a drug. You could easily make a drug out of a flavanol product, but it's available as a dietary supplement now. And by the way, and this is very important, that product can continue to be available as a dietary supplement. And it will not preclude the marketing of other similar or identical products. The only difference is if a dietary supplement wins a Healthspan claim, that only that product would be able to put their claim on the wrapper or whatever it is. So in the case of a product that's had a major cardiovascular outcome trial, as was the case for the flavanol product that you mentioned, that counts. The trial results were pretty convincing, although for some technical reasons we don't have to get into, it was not considered by current standards a positive trial. But it's the kind of evidence that would or could be persuasive for a tier 1 approval, maybe not for a tier 2 and certainly not for a tier 3 approval. But that, along with other supportive evidence, and there is abundant evidence that supports the effects of flavanol on cognitive function, on blood pressure, on lipids. And so there's there are strong priors that particular product could actually increase Healthspan. I'm not saying that the evidence reaches the level. that's a job that would have to be done by the regulators. But it's just a good example of how a dietary supplement could be given a Healthspan claim. And by the way, they would have to go through the kind of process that the drugs go through. They can't get a Healthspan claim just by submitting their application and not having a pre-market review process. They're going to have to go through that hoop. But the company can still continue to market that dietary supplement. This does not change DSHEA, the Dietary Health and Education Act, one bit. It just provides another option, an additional option for dietary supplements.
Can I call up one of the questions David in Q&A commented? The novel feature of the act seems to be the new Tier 1 approval mode. So how does it differ in practical terms from Tier 2 and 3? And what happens? Will approval at Tier would have to pass through Tier 2 and Tier 3, et cetera? Good question.
Well,
Zan, I think why don't you answer this?
Well, I'll just start out, and again, these are the categories of evidence. We can't possibly get down into the details of just what would be necessary and sufficient, and it would be the totality of evidence. There is no single category of evidence here that would by itself allow for a approval of a Tier 1 indication. But this is the framework. It's not the details. And go ahead, Dave.
Well, let me answer the second question first, which is that if a sponsor wanted to go directly to Tier 2 or Tier 3, they could. They are not required to go through Tier 1. So if they already are amassing clinical data, they could go ahead. They're not required to step through all three. On the first question, I think what's different and noteworthy about Tier 1, and this is where I think Zan, you might want to speak to this a little bit more, is the nature of the evidence. And so Tier 1 opens the door to a form of marketing approval in which we don't have true clinical endpoint type data. We don't have classical clinical endpoint type data, and we don't yet have what would amount to a surrogate marker reasonably likely to predict under an accelerated approval standard. Instead, it relies on probably a totality of other forms of evidence, this sort of developing field of evidence, along with calibration to the safety profile of the product. So we're thinking for relatively low risk products where there's compelling science, but not clinical outcome types science, we'd be willing to let the product on the market to advance the policy of Healthspan. And let me just emphasize just one, if there's one thing to think about to draw all this together, why it makes sense now, it's that point that Eve raised, that the uncertainty point. So that's at the heart of regulatory science. And what's the nature of the uncertainty? And I'd say I'm not the scientist here. I'm the last person to speak of the science, but what the scientists are telling us, or telling me, is that the nature of the uncertainty is much, much different today than it was when we passed prior versions of the Act. And we can look at the science at a much more granular level. And so we're taking less of a risk that we're completely off the mark. And because we feel like we can control for that uncertainty in a wholly different way, it allows us then to go to market without the classical empirical evidence of I don't know it until I've observed it in the human population.
David, how would you compare this? Because I could see the question is, how is Tier 1 different from conditional approval, which has its own history as a concept and its own emotions that it generates.
This may be a little bit too abstract than what you're looking for, but it's the nature of the regulatory decision. It is a decision. It's a conclusive decision that based on this evidence, we believe there's truth to the level that Congress said we needed to find it in order to allow the product on the market. So while there are requirements that a sponsor would need to fulfill to maintain their place on the market over time and to get to higher levels, you'll see that in the act, even if you don't reach tier 2 or tier 3, you still maintain your earlier approval. So it's the approval itself at each tier is not qualified or conditioned. It is a full determination based on the available evidence that Congress said is sufficient to reach that conclusion. So I know that sounds it's a little bit of there's some circularity in there, but in some ways it's not conditional approval if we don't call it such.
Yeah. Well, and what it's important to point out that the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 in the actual wording of the act is just likely versus very likely, or no, it's
appears reasonably likely versus
appears
likely.
reasonably likely versus likely. That's the difference in semantics, but the devil is in the detail as to what that constitutes. And just let me also mention another consideration in taking the risk that the evidence is not ultimately going to be confirmed. And that is the safety of the product. It goes without saying that the benefit to risk relationship has to be acceptable at every tier, starting with tier 1. So you're not going to see gene therapies in tier 1 in all probability, at least in the foreseeable future. But you need to have a certain level of safety. Maybe it's an endogenous metabolite, it's a commonly occurring product in the food supply, or we otherwise have abundant experience with it, even marketing experience like we have with GLP-1 agonists. But the point is, you've got to have some level at tier 1 of high assurance that there's not going to be a safety issue.
By the way, how about the question or claim that tier 2 and tier 3 is nothing new? It's a nothing burger. There is a difference, obviously, at tier 2. It's not limited to serious life-threatening medical conditions and life-threatening diseases, or at least it seems to suggest Healthspan, preserving Healthspan fits that criterion. But is it true that given the structure and direction of the Act, the Thrive Act, there could be more of a totality of evidence that could affect tier 2 and tier 3 so that they shouldn't be thought of as exact clones of accelerated approval and traditional approval?
No, I don't think we have to make them exactly alike, but for conceptual purposes, we compare the tier 2 level of evidence with that involved with an accelerated approval. Now, the reason the accelerated approval doesn't work for preventing chronic diseases is because the interpretation of FDA is that these the diseases that are the subject of a accelerated approval need to be for imminently life-threatening conditions. And so typically, we see most of these approvals for cancer drugs. Now, ironically, the Center for Veterinary Medicine does have a provision that does allow for chronic disease prevention as what they call a conditional approval. They don't use the word conditional on the drug side, the human drug side, but it is used in CVM, and it's actually kind of a model for a mid-level standard of evidence for approving a Healthspan product.
Yeah, on the CVM side, just to be clear, it's essentially a safety first approval, and then you by law, you develop the efficacy evidence over time while you're on the market. And that's what makes it it's conditional in that it's more like a peri-approval. You're approved on safety with efficacy coming later. And that's what's different about ours. Even in tier 1, FDA is making efficacy finding. It's an efficacy finding that is based on the types of evidence that on which the statute would place value. Preclinical evidence and mechanistic evidence and other forms of evidence. But that evidence is sufficient. We're saying it's sufficient to make a full tier 1 efficacy determination. Now, that's not a full ultimate health span determination. It's a determination within the parameters of a tier 1 approval. So that's what's different. That's what's different even from the CBM. It's not a promise of efficacy evidence later, that you do have efficacy evidence even at tier 1.
Well, David, the way I was taught it, which doesn't make it the right way, is that some evidence of efficacy is actually a safety concern. Because if you give people a safe product that has no benefit, then
absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely. So right, so and that's even at tier 1,
which is why people
demonstrated benefit has to outweigh the safety risks.
Yeah, so even at tier 1 in the current system, people have to look for efficacy because otherwise the risk benefit balance falls off.
Right. If the efficacy is so speculative and the evidence is just it doesn't connect, it's completely abstract and theoretical, it could not outweigh the safety risk of the product.
On the other hand,
if the product has no burden, it has no safety, it has no pharmacologic activity. Right? It's the whole point. There's no free lunch, right? That's the Bob Temple. There's no free lunch in pharmacology, right? If it's going to be effective, it's got to have a risk. Otherwise, it's a cosmetic.
We're coming
That's
down
the
to
only product we don't include in the
Stephen, you look like you had a point. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to come back to what I think some of these questions and some of these answers miss, which is if we were doing it by diabetes and cardiovascular, the system is just fine, if more than a little slow in getting the benefit to people. This is about having something that is novel relative to the existing system, something that is going to attack a biological mechanism, something that's going to have an effect on multiple chronic diseases. And again, as I understand it, I'm no statistician. If you go in and you say, well, this prevents it helps cardiovascular, it helps diabetes, and it helps the liver or the kidney. And FDA is going to come back and say, well, if any of 3 outcomes is a positive, then, oh, by the way, your level of proof is P.001 or 01, just 001, I guess it is, because of multiplicity. And so one of the things that lies in the back of all of this is that a lot of the products that might qualify under this pathway could move forward, except that what we're trying to prove for them would create multiplicity in a way that would make it almost impossible to run a trial. Leaving aside the N would have to be enormous.
Yeah, well, that's the technical issue that is worth pointing out, actually operates today in the evaluation of cardiovascular claims. Multiplicity of composite endpoints is taken into account. And typically, it's myocardial infarction that drives that composite. And that would be the same consideration for a composite of multiple chronic diseases, as you say. But the way the Thrive Act would perhaps address the issue is to lower the strenuousness of the multiplicity test. Again, we're getting down into the weeds. probably not worth doing that, given we have so many questions and only 0 time left in our session. Though, let me just say, we'll keep going as long as people want to hang on. We're at time, but gosh, what a great discussion we've been having. And I'd love to keep going for the entire afternoon. But
let me draw a formal close to the events here. This is the beginning of a long conversation on regulatory pathways, fit for purpose evidence, and the incentives for Healthspan products. And we'd love to hear from you. You can put your questions and comments. We'll probably transfer the chat ideas and the questions into our Thrive Act discussion board at kitalys.org. So all registrants will receive the link to the recording within a day or so, as well as announcements for future Targeting Healthy Longevity 2025 sessions. We had a session with FDA officials and geroscientists planned for early this month, but it's being rescheduled to a little bit later this year because we need to give the new FDA leadership a chance to settle in. And we also have a workshop in planning for approaches to frailty and sarcopenia. So with that, the formal portion of this event is closed. I thank the panelists and you, the audience, for your attendance. We will be leaving the Zoom webinar open for some minutes for those speakers and audience who are available to tarry and chat. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Closure. End of scene.
all right, we're now at the podium after the, well, we didn't have a podium. We had a round table.
It's a virtual dais, but I did have a philosophical question, and people, please go ahead and chat. The people who are staying in the room, but you know, this is a philosophical question. Under what, and this builds on the safety discussion we had near the end there. Under what circumstances could it be justified to give interventions to younger, leaner, healthy people when 85% of health seems to be due to lifestyle? Is that just an overly provocative question, or is that a serious policy question?
Well, I think that is a conjecture that there isn't residual risk that cannot be relieved any more than 15%. I don't accept that that is the case, but let's say it's 50-50. It's still a concern. I would readily admit that why should we put the kind of effort we're doing now into regulated, expensive products and not just mandate that everybody do what they were taught in kindergarten about eating healthy, being active, and doing other things that are known to be good for you?
Can I just say, you know, I'm thinking ahead to what an act ultimately would look like and what a regulation would ultimately look like once we get past all the initial stages of development and everything. And ideally, in my mind, you know, as science moves ahead, it's going to solve some of these problems for us. So, I mean, for example, if you could say we have a verifiable, accurate biological clock that measures age, then that would be an endpoint, I think, that we could work towards.
Well, if we had that endpoint, it changes everything.
Right.
Because we have the precedent of LDL cholesterol, with which we approve the statins. We have HbA1c, by which we approve drugs for diabetes. So having those has made it so much easier to approve products for those conditions. So once we have a validated clock or any other biomarker, wow, that changes things by a lot. But here's the rub. To get that validation means we have to have an intervention that actually moves the needle and that we can show there's a correlation with that readout. It's a catch-22, and it's going to take a good while to be able to show that we actually have products that we can, in effect, run through the validation procedure and to actually get those data.
Right. And we need longitudinal studies to show, you know, comparisons between, you know, the state of health before that intervention and the state of health after a certain amount of time has passed. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, a lot of devil in the details, and this is not going to make things happen overnight for sure. And as mentioned, we're not even ready to go to Congress yet. We got to workshop this thing until we have a consensus around it and broad support from all the stakeholders.
Eve, also, I think part of what you're raising is what we would call a drafting issue. So we want the legislation to be enabling, but we don't want it to be so detailed and prescriptive that it prejudges the science, where the science is headed. So you want to kind of strike the right balance in the legislation of being sufficiently open-ended that as the science evolves, it will fit into the legislation without having to go back and pass new law. So right now, people can quibble over this, but right now we live in a regulatory system for drugs that's based on the 1962 substantial evidence standard. Mm-hmm. Now you could say that's a success because that standard has stood the test of time and has allowed FDA to incorporate all sorts of new science into it. But it's also become a problem because it leaves almost all the decisions on hard FDA problems to an ad hoc, behind the scenes, improvisational effort, flexibility. So we want flexibility, but so much flexibility makes the system unpredictable and subject to the proclivities of individual reviewers. So you're always trying to strike the balance between something that's broad enough that will stand the test of time and will be able to absorb new science, but something that doesn't leave it is not so open-ended that nobody really knows what the standard is. And so that's a legislative drafting issue. And as Zan keeps reminding us, we can only get so far with the legislation, and then a lot is going to have to be offloaded to the regulatory development process of guidance and interaction with the industry and stakeholder meetings and that whole evolutionary process on the details. Mm-hmm. But I think we have a pretty good visual of what an act would look like. It needs some refinement for internal consistency. There's a few more ideas it might want to incorporate. It probably is a reach in a few places, but if you want to visualize what it would look like, it's not really that far off the mark.
Mm-hmm. For anybody who's hung up on that, I think I may have been somewhere earlier in the chain, the one who pushed for it to be done in bill form, because putting it in bill form creates both a structure and helps you understand what it is you're missing, because you're thinking immediately about what is it that various players in the future under whatever program we're advancing. And so I hope people don't get hung up on the fact that it's in legislative form, even though it's not ready to be offered as legislation. It is a very useful tool.
That's right.
And who knows because we've got a Supreme Court decision that nobody really has had any time to implement, that says we need a lot more detail in our laws so that they can be implemented by regulatory agencies with a minimum of ambiguity and a minimum of uncertainty. All that additional workshopping might prove to be essential and wind up in the end needing to be some of it moved back into an act.
Can I pose a
That's
question from one of the registrants? And the question was, how does the Thrive Act promote healthy longevity equitably for all? And that's not the main purpose, obviously, of the Thrive Act, but the question deserves an answer, I think.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
that could be a long-term process because, obviously, if you're generating new cures and new therapies, they're going to be available to a limited number of people in the beginning, but then economies of scale kick in. So, this is something that potentially affects every human being on the planet. So, once we understand that and national health systems understand that, and regulatory bodies understand that, then you're going to get economies of scale. We're a long way from that now. We're still in the, early stages of a lot of these kinds of therapies, but the trajectory in terms of how the cures and therapies have ultimately been delivered, is that yes, they initially are available to a select few, and over time, the net widens and widens until they become adopted by healthcare systems and universal coverage and things like that. So,
Yeah, I think that's so well said, Eve. In effect,
Mhm.
if you bring the evidence, the payers will come, and
Mm-hmm.
they will come for the larger populations. Um, the Center for uh, Medicaid Service or Medical Services will be there if the economic case is made based on the evidence. And that's addressing Thomas's question. Why is this, in effect, helping to address inequities, health inequities in our society? And it would do that by, among other things, economy of scale, that the cost of the products would go down on a unit basis so that it would be affordable or reimbursed by
I agree.
healthcare
And
payers.
one of the things that I've been thinking about, when I reviewed some of the questions that came in last night, about the economy of using, of increasing the health span, is that, there's very little understanding of the fact that increasing the health span goes far beyond science and medicine. It goes well into all the social, every facet of society. So
Right.
it's also very complicated because there are determinants, there are non-medical, non-biological determinants of health span, things like social support and education level, lifestyle. Of course, we've mentioned that a lot. But we're working on one side of this, and I think we need to look at how this eventually is going to spill over into multiple layers of education, social, programs, and things along those lines that have been shown to show, a significant role in health span and healthy aging.
Yeah. Amen.
I'd like to take on for a minute the question Alan Chiquimo asks about patient advocacy. And, why hasn't anybody mentioned patient advocacy here? And I don't know. On one level, I don't know because I don't know who David and Zan have been talking to along the way. But I do see conceptually there's a bit of a problem because you got to convince the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, that there's a pooled benefit from health span products. I don't know that that's such a heavy lift, but it does put them in a different paradigm than they work on every day and every week.
Right. Mm.
That unfortunately is true, Stephen. It's really part and parcel of our challenge that it's easier to address the patient with an acute disease in front of you than it is to take time to cancel that patient to do what could help to prevent the disease. And so it's a whole misallocation of our resources towards, as Eve said, sick care. That's much easier for the physician to do. It takes much less time on a per unit basis than preventive care, which is not sufficiently incented.
So the physician is the servant of the disease model, and FDA is the servant of the disease model, and the disease groups are the servant of the disease model. And so I guess one answer would be this is more revolutionary than anybody thinks.
So from
Well, I think
Stephen,
that's right.
that's kind of the argument to be made for looking at aging as a disease, because our whole system is predicated on this model of the disease process.
Yeah. Well, you can look at it either way. You can look at it from a negative framing or a positive framing. I would rather look at it as increasing health span versus decreasing risk of disease. They ultimately, it doesn't make any difference in terms of the clinical trials that would be necessary to approve either form of indication. But I am more attracted to the positive formulation than to the negative.
Oh, I am too. I totally agree with you, Zan, and I think that really is part and parcel of just kind of, this whole concept of changing the entire way that we view disease progression and health, along the lifespan.
Well, that's right. And the other distinction between the population of people who have disease and may have very strong advocacy groups behind them is that we're talking about the would-be non-patient, the person who doesn't want to become a patient and doesn't have any kind of stakeholder status. And so it is a challenge when you're starting with a population that's diffuse, large, unorganized, not listened to directly.
But there have been, in terms of surveys that are done of the public about, would you like to live to be 120? Things like that. If you ask people that, most of them will say, well, no, because in their mind, being 120 is a catastrophe, physically, biologically, medically, and in every way. But if you ask them, would you like to live to be 100 in a state of good health and vitality, then overwhelmingly they would say, of course.
Yeah. And you just described in another fashion Healthspan.
Right.
And that's why the focus is on Healthspan, not on preventing disease or not on treating aging as a disease.
Right. How can healthy normals stay healthy and normal for as long as possible?
That's right.
That's
the question and the proposition.
The FDA system is just not geared towards healthy normals, and to the extent it is, it is in areas that are not evidence-based, not to the rigor that we prefer.
And Dave, it's because sponsors are not coming to FDA.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
If they were, I think FDA would be.
Talk about health equity. I mean, we basically have a system in which people who feel like they're relatively healthy, normal, they're in homeostasis and good balance. They have to basically find their own evidence and do their own work very imperfectly and spend a lot of their own dollars on things that probably don't do anything for them in order to try to maintain that state of balance.
That's right.
And then once they get off balance, we know it's virtually impossible ever to get them back into balance. And they live the rest of their lives with, healthcare costs and unfortunately, an imperfect healthcare treatment system.
Exactly right.
I mean, I think that, to me, that's the equitable case. On the patient advocacy part, and Zan has forbidden me from using the word patient, so I'm a little constrained. But one thing that I have been pushing on is part of a cultural shift at FDA. Is FDA does have patient listening meetings, and they have various patient stakeholder meetings, trying to learn from patients what they want in terms of clinical endpoints. An agency brings in experts, and this is a regular process. And I would like to see at least an agenda item on all of those meetings in which at least some time is dedicated to thinking about the pre-disease and preventive period.
Yeah,
so that is very, I understand that is very disease specific, so it's not quite within our our mandate, but I just think culturally it's just a blind spot that we've allowed to hold for much too long. And even if there is nothing to report, I think every meeting when FDA meets with patients should have some moment where they're thinking about, okay, is there something more we could be doing on the early stages or pre-disease or preventive part?
Yeah, and Dave, I do agree that there's room in the act for addressing this objective, for including the voice of the would not be patient.
Correct.
And we should do that. We in the fullness of time. We were just pressed to the max, and I didn't think we could really credibly describe how this would be done without just making it look like it was window dressing.
Well, there was a draft section that that ended up on the cutting floor, but maybe we can throw it up on our discussion board so that people can comment on it.
It's a great idea. Let's put it up for discussion. And we hope there'll be a lot more in the coming weeks. We'd like to follow up at some point with another get together, and we'll do it as a web meeting so people can actually get up and yell at us.
Maybe this is a good time to close. We look forward to being yelled at in a town hall setting. And I thank everybody who stayed with us in the audience. And can I, Zan, again, wish everybody a great weekend. Thanks for
Yes,
this
indeed.
event.
And thank you all.